Tariq had always found comfort in solitude. For years, he had lived in the hustle and bustle of the city, always surrounded by noise, people, and the endless demands of his job. But now, after years of hard work, he had finally managed to escape. He had inherited his grandfather's house in Rawalpindi, a place he had visited as a child but never truly explored. The house, tucked away on a quiet street, was both intimidating and charming. Despite its age and weathered exterior, it had an aura of mystery. Tariq was drawn to it, even though others spoke of the house with whispers and uneasy glances. The house was large, with old wooden beams, a grand staircase, and a thick smell of must and age that clung to the air. The garden was overrun with weeds, and the windows were boarded up with old planks of wood. It was a house that had been abandoned for years, and yet it was still standing, strong, as though waiting for something. Tariq didn't mind the house's neglected state. In fact, he found it peaceful. He spent his first week cleaning, dusting off old furniture, and getting rid of the cobwebs. The place felt alive in a way, as if it had been waiting for him to return. He spent the first few nights there with nothing but the sound of his own footsteps echoing through the halls. And yet, each night, something felt off. It wasn't anything tangible. There were no sounds that couldn't be explained, no shadows moving in the corner of his eyes. But Tariq had an unsettling feeling that he was being watched, as though something unseen was in the house with him. The house seemed to breathe, its creaks and groans becoming louder in the dead of night, making Tariq's heart race as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. One evening, as the sun began to set, Tariq decided to go for a walk through the garden. The storm clouds had gathered in the sky, heavy and dark. The wind picked up, sending leaves swirling around his feet. As he walked through the garden, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The house, which had felt like a refuge during the day, now felt like a looming presence, something oppressive, as if the very walls of the house were watching him. He brushed off the unease, telling himself it was just the storm and the isolation getting to him. Tariq had always prided himself on being rational, but that night, something changed. The storm grew worse, the rain coming down in torrents as Tariq returned to the house. He went inside and tried to relax, but the power suddenly went out, plunging the house into darkness. Tariq grumbled in frustration and fumbled around in the dark for a flashlight. The wind howled outside, and the sound of the rain against the windows was deafening. He grabbed the flashlight from a drawer in the kitchen, clicked it on, and made his way through the house to check the fuse box. As he entered the basement, he noticed that the air felt unusually cold, and the hairs on his neck stood up. Tariq paused, a strange sensation creeping over him. He couldn't explain it. There was a presence in the air, something invisible but undeniably real. His heart thudded in his chest as he made his way deeper into the basement, trying to focus on fixing the fuse box. That's when it happened. Tariq heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, coming from upstairs. He stopped in his tracks, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The footsteps were soft, but distinct, and they seemed to be moving across the wooden floors above him. Tariq stood still for a moment, holding his breath, trying to convince himself that it was just the house settling. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He had been alone in the house all day. There shouldn't have been anyone there. The footsteps grew louder, as though someone was walking across the hallway above him. Tariq's heart began to race, and he quickly climbed the stairs, trying to quiet his breathing. As he reached the top, he stopped and listened. The house was still, the sound of the rain outside drowning out everything else. There was no one there, no footsteps, no sounds, just silence. Tariq slowly walked through the house, checking every room. Tariq reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling as he turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room. The air inside was thick with dust, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. Tariq stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating the corners of the room. The whispers stopped the moment he entered. Tariq looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was bare except for a few pieces of old furniture, a broken chair in the corner, and a thick layer of dust that covered everything. But there, in the middle of the room, was something that made his stomach drop. An old, cracked mirror. The frame was ornate, its edges twisted into strange shapes that seemed to move as the light flickered across them. Tariq walked toward the mirror, his eyes fixed on the reflection. At first, he saw nothing but himself, his tired, disheveled face staring back at him. But as he stood there, staring into the glass, something began to change. He blinked, and for a brief moment, his reflection wasn't quite right. It was subtle, just a small movement that didn't match his own. His reflection blinked when he didn't. Tariq froze, his breath caught in his throat. He stepped back, but the reflection didn't move. It was still. He took another step back, but this time, his reflection followed him too quickly. His reflection was smiling. It wasn't a simple smile. It was wide, unnatural, as if the reflection knew something he didn't. Tariq's heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He turned away from the mirror and rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The house felt different now, heavier, as if it had been watching him all along. The whispers started again, soft, distant, but growing louder. Tariq ran through the house, his mind spinning. He had to leave. He had to get out of there. But as he reached the front door, he realized something. He couldn't find the key. The door, once easily unlocked, was now stuck. Tariq pulled at the handle, panic rising in his chest. He turned around, searching for another exit, but the house seemed to stretch on endlessly. It was as though the rooms were shifting, moving around him. The stairs he had just climbed were now a hallway he didn't recognize. The windows that should have been visible from the front door were gone, replaced by walls. The whispers had turned into laughter, cold and mocking, filling the air around him. Tariq's mind raced. He turned, but this time he saw it, the figure standing in the hallway. A shadow, tall and menacing, its features hidden in the darkness. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. Tariq ran, his footsteps echoing through the house, but no matter how fast he went, he couldn't escape the feeling of being pursued. He turned a corner and found himself face to face with the figure. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to stare right through him. He screamed. But when he turned to run again, the house was empty. The next morning, when the storm cleared, the house was still. But Tariq was gone. The front door was wide open, and his belongings were left behind, untouched. Neighbors found the house as if it had always been abandoned, waiting. But some say the figure still waits, watching for the next soul to wander in, never to leave. As Tariq stumbled through the endless maze of the house, his breath ragged and his heart pounding, he began to lose his sense of time. The once familiar rooms had turned into an oppressive labyrinth, each corner looking like the next. No matter how hard he tried, the doors remained locked, the windows sealed shut as if the house had turned against him. The whispers were louder now, rising into frantic calls. His name was being chanted over and over in a distorted voice, almost mocking him. Tariq, Tariq, Tariq. It echoed from the walls, from the floorboards, and from every dark corner. The house was alive, and it wanted him. He had to escape. He had to break free from whatever was keeping him here. His mind was racing, the fear surging in his veins, but his body couldn't keep up. Each step felt heavier, as though the house itself was pulling him down. Then, as he rounded another corner, he saw it again, the figure. It stood motionless in the middle of the hallway, blocking his path. The coldness emanating from it made the air around him freeze. Tariq's knees buckled as he felt an invisible force pushing him back, as if the figure was drawing him into its dark, endless void. But this time something was different. The figure moved, slowly, unnaturally, its limbs stretched out like a puppet being controlled by unseen hands. Tariq tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His body refused to obey him as his legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, trembling. The figure took a step closer, its eyes hollow, empty voids that seemed to draw him in. It smiled again, its lips curling into a grotesque grin. The smile widened unnaturally until it seemed as though the figure's face was stretching far beyond the limits of its own skin. Tariq's pulse hammered in his ears as the figure whispered, "No," commanded him, in a voice that was both distant and right next to him at the same time. "You can never leave," it hissed. Tariq felt an overwhelming pressure in his chest, as though the very air was being sucked out of him. His vision blurred, his mind filled with a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts. The house, the figure, it was all consuming him. pulling him into an abyss from which there was no return. He was being suffocated, drowned in darkness. In a final desperate act, Tariq gathered every ounce of strength he had left. With a ragged breath, he pushed himself up to his feet, ignoring the pain that shot through his body. He could feel the figure's cold breath against his neck, but he didn't care. He ran. He ran blindly, his legs moving faster than he had ever run in his life, his chest heaving with every step. The house was still shifting around him, but Tariq didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He had to escape. And then, just as his legs gave out and he was about to collapse, he saw it, a door standing open, the front door, the one he had been desperately searching for. He burst through it, into the night air, gasping for breath. He fell to his knees, the cold rain hitting his face, the sound of the storm deafening around him. But as he looked back at the house, he froze. The figure was standing in the doorway, its eyes locked onto his. The door swung shut with an eerie finality, and the house seemed to settle into an unnatural silence. Tariq stood there, frozen in terror, as the lights of the house flickered and went out, leaving only darkness in its wake. He didn't know how he had escaped, how he had managed to break free from the grip of that house. But he knew one thing for certain. The house wasn't done with him. As he turned and ran from the house, the whispers followed him into the night. They were soft at first, but then they grew louder, more insistent. His name, carried on the wind, seemed to call to him from every direction. Tariq, you can't escape me.